Okay, so we've got this really interesting blog post, right? All about the rules and regs for foreigners who want to rent out property in Thailand.
Yeah, lots of folks are curious about that. It can seem a little complicated, but it's super important to get it right.
Exactly. That's why we're doing this deep dive, so we can break it all down, make it clear, and hopefully help anyone out there thinking of becoming a landlord in Thailand.
You got it. I mean, think about it. Owning property overseas, that's already a big step, right?
Mm.
But then renting it out, that adds a whole other layer of things to think about.
Yeah, no kidding, especially in a place like Thailand. Okay, so where do we even start? I mean, the blog post we got, it's from this company called Ocean Worldwide, right?
Yep, Ocean Worldwide, they're kind of a big deal in luxury real estate in Thailand. They've been around since 2004, based in, well, they pronounce it Phuket. Most people say Phuket.
Phuket. Okay, Phuket it is.
Yeah.
So Ocean Worldwide, they know their stuff, right? I mean, been doing this a long time.
Right, yeah. Their director, Sandra O'Neill, she's helped literally thousands of families and investors navigate this market, especially in places like Phuket and Koh Samui, which are like prime spots for vacation homes and all that.
Okay, so we're in good hands with this blog post. So I guess the first thing, the very first hurdle, is figuring out what foreigners can actually own, right? I mean, can you just buy land outright in Thailand?
So that's the thing. It's not quite that straightforward. Foreigners can't just go and buy land directly.
Oh, really? So what can they own?
Buildings. You can own the building itself, but the land it's on, that's a different story.
Huh. So, like, you own the house, but not the dirt under it.
Kind of. You can lease the land, though. Long-term leaseholds are pretty common. So you've got the right to use the land for a long time, even if you don't own it outright.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. But condos are a little different, right? You mentioned those earlier.
Yeah, condos are interesting. You can buy them outright, but there are quotas for foreign ownership in most developments. So only a certain percentage of units can be owned by non-Thais.
Oh, I see. Makes sense. So I guess figuring out what you can own and how you own it, that's like the very first puzzle piece, right?
Absolutely. And Ocean Worldwide, they really stress this point, Get good legal advice early on. It's the best way to avoid headaches later. Someone who specializes in Thai property law, who can walk you through all the options.
Yeah, like a good guide for the whole journey. Okay, so let's say you've figured out the ownership thing. What's next? Paperwork, I'm guessing.
Always paperwork. It's crucial in a situation like this. Let's see, what does Ocean Worldwide say? Oh, yeah, so you'll need your passport, obviously, and a visa.
Mm.
But it can't be just any visa.
What do you mean?
It has to be valid for your entire stay, the whole time you plan to be in Thailand.
Ah, okay. So if you're planning to be there for a while, you need a long-term visa.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
proof of funds. They want to see where the money for the property came from. Clean and clear. Yeah,
Of course. And the sale agreement, I'm assuming?
right. That's a must. But here's the thing, and this is super important. All these documents, they need Thai translations. Official ones, too. Certified and everything.
Oh, wow. So it's not just having the documents. You need them in Thai, too.
Yeah. Think of it like having the key to your front door, but it doesn't work unless you have the matching key for the back door, too.
Okay, that's a good way to put it. So passport, visa, proof of funds, sale agreement, all translated and certified. Sounds like a pretty hefty stack of paperwork.
It is, but trust me, it's worth it. It's a big deal in Thailand. Skipping this step can cause you a lot of trouble down the line.
Right. Better to be safe than sorry. Okay, so we've got the ownership and the documents sorted. What about the local laws? I mean, are there specific Thai laws that foreign property owners need to be extra aware of?
Oh, absolutely. You're playing on their field now, right? Owning property in Thailand, it means you've got to play by their rules.
Right, so what kind of rules are we talking about?
Well, everything, really. Paying your taxes, of course, that's a given anywhere, but also things like building codes. You have to make sure your property meets all the local standards.
Makes sense. So I guess ignorance is not a good excuse here, huh?
Nope, not at all. And Ocean Worldwide, they make this really clear. You can't just say, oh, I didn't know, if you get caught breaking the rules.
Yikes. Are there any specific laws that are, like, super important for foreign landlords?
Yeah, one that Ocean Worldwide specifically mentions is the Hotel Act. This is a big one, especially if you're thinking about doing short-term rentals.
Short-term rentals, you mean like Airbnb and stuff?
Exactly. If you're renting out your place for less than a month, like on a daily or weekly basis, the Hotel Act might apply.
Mm-hmm.
And that could mean you need a special license, basically treating your property as a mini hotel.
Wow. Okay, so that's something to definitely look into. So we've got the ownership part, the documents, the general legal landscape. Now let's zoom in on those rental laws. What are the must-knows for foreign landlords in Thailand?
Okay, so when you go from just owning a property to actually becoming a landlord, that's where things get a little more, I don't know, specific.
Okay. Specific in what way?
Well, there are all these local regulations about leases. Things like how long the lease can be, what needs to be in it, all that kind of stuff.
Oh, I see. So like a lease in Thailand, it's not just a simple agreement between two people, right? It's got to meet certain legal requirements.
Right. And Ocean Worldwide, they highlight a few really important things to keep in mind. First off, you need to have all your documentation in order.
Oh, like those translated documents we talked about earlier?
Yep, those, but also documents that prove you are who you say you are, that you are legally allowed to rent out this property, all that.
Got it. Documentation. Always documentation. What else?
Okay, second thing, if your lease is going to be longer than 3 years, you have to register it with the land office.
Land office. What's that?
It's like the government agency that deals with land ownership and stuff like that. They need to officially record your lease.
Oh, okay. So anything over 3 years, got to get it officially stamped.
Exactly. Makes it legally binding. And third, your rental price needs to be clear, and it can't be like crazy high or anything. It has to make sense.
So no price gouging allowed. Fair enough. What was that last thing you mentioned? About specific rental programs?
Oh, yeah, that. Some property developments, they have their own rental programs. These can be really helpful for foreign owners. It's like having someone else handle all the day-to-day stuff.
Oh, interesting. So it's like a built-in property manager.
Yeah, kind of. It's definitely worth asking about if you're buying in a development. Okay, so we talked about what you need to do to rent out your property legally, but what about your actual rights and responsibilities as a landlord?
Right. Because it's not just about following the rules. It's about understanding what you can and can't do, what you are and aren't responsible for.
Exactly. So as a foreign landlord in Thailand, you do have certain rights. For example, you get to decide how your property can be used.
Okay. So you can set some rules for your tenants.
Yeah, like no pets or no smoky inside, things like that.
Yeah.
Of course, these rules have to be within the law. You can't be unreasonable.
Right. Makes sense. Any other rights?
You also have the right to agree on the monthly rent with your tenant. You're both adults. You can negotiate.
Okay. So those are the rights. What about the responsibilities?
Okay, so big responsibility.
Yeah.
You're in charge of making sure the property is safe and livable for your tenants.
Okay. So like basic maintenance stuff.
More than basic. You
Nice.
got to make sure it's in good repair, that it's safe, no hazards, things like that.
Got it. Safe and sound. What else?
Notice periods.
Hmm.
If you want to change the lease terms, you have to give your tenants enough notice. It's the law.
Oh, yeah, of course. Can't just spring changes on them out of the blue.
Right. And honestly, this is where Ocean Worldwide makes a really good point. Communication is key. Talking to your tenants, being upfront, being clear, that can prevent so many problems.
Communication is key. Always good advice. Okay, let's dig into the legal nitty-gritty here. The actual framework for rentals in Thailand. What are the standard conditions, the things everyone needs to be aware of?
Thailand has these rental regulations, right?
Yeah.
It's to make sure everything is clear and that both landlords and tenants are protected.
Okay, that makes sense. And what are some of the key things in those regulations?
Well, let's see. Ocean Worldwide gives a pretty good rundown. Lease duration. So how long your lease is. Usually it's between 1 and 3 years.
Okay, that's pretty standard. But can you do longer leases?
You can. Longer leases are possible, but anything over 3 years, remember, that has to be registered with the land department. It's like the official seal of approval.
Right, got it. Anything else about leases?
The security deposit. Typically, it's 1 to 2 months rent. It's standard practice, gives the landlord a bit of a cushion if the tenant damages the property or skips out on rent.
Makes sense. So that's something to be aware of when you're budgeting, right? I mean, 2 months rent, that's a chunk of change.
Definitely. And then there's the termination notice, usually 30 days. But it's super important to have that clearly stated in your lease agreement.
So everyone knows what to expect if they need to break the lease early?
Yep, no surprises. And honestly, the best advice here, read your lease agreement carefully. Every single clause.
Word for word. Come on.
Seriously, ambiguity is a landlord's worst enemy. It's way better to be overly cautious than end up in some legal mess because something wasn't clear in the lease.
Okay, you've convinced me. Lease agreements, got to read them carefully. Now let's talk about the part nobody likes. Taxes. What are the tax obligations for foreign landlords in Thailand?
Oh yeah, taxes. Can't escape those.
Nope. So what's the deal?
The deal is, if you're a foreigner earning rental income in Thailand, you got to pay taxes on that income.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's income, right? So it gets taxed. What's the rate?
It varies. Ocean Worldwide says it can be anywhere from 5% to 35%, depending on your total income.
Wow, that's a pretty big range.
It is. It all goes by the Income Tax Act. And it's not just for Thai residents. Foreign landlords got to pay up too.
So everyone's in the same boat when it comes to taxes on rental income.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And on top of income tax, you've got property tax. It's about 12.5% of the annual rental value.
Oh, wow. Another tax on top of the income tax.
Yep. Ocean Worldwide suggests factoring that into your rental pricing. That way you're not losing money.
Yeah, good point. It's all part of the business, right? Anything else about taxes?
There's also this thing called withholding tax, which can be a bit tricky. If you're renting to a foreigner and they are renting from a company, there's a 5% withholding tax on their rent. Usually it's the landlord's responsibility to handle that. And if your tenant sublets the property or they're earning some kind of income from it, they might also have to pay personal income tax. Honestly, taxes are a whole other beast. Ocean Worldwide really recommends getting professional tax advice. It's worth it.
Yeah, I can see why. Taxes, definitely not something you want to mess around with.
Hmm.
Okay, let's circle back to those lease agreements. What are the absolute must-have elements of a solid lease?
Okay, so a good lease agreement, it's like your shield, right? It protects everyone. It lays out all the expectations clearly.
Okay, what kind of things need to be in there?
Well, first off, the names, all the parties involved, landlord, tenant, everyone. And a clear, detailed description of the property. Not just the address, but like how many rooms, what kind of amenities, all that.
Okay, so everyone knows exactly what property we're talking about.
Exactly. And of course, the rent, how much, when it's due, how it's paid, all that needs to be crystal clear. And the lease duration. How long is this agreement for? 1 year, 3 years? Got to be specific.
Makes sense. Anything else?
Rules and restrictions. Anything specific about how the property can be used. Like, can they have parties? Can they sublet? All that stuff.
Oh, right. Laying down the law, so to speak.
Exactly. And a few more things. Clauses about maintenance. Who's responsible for what? Security deposit terms. When do they get it back? What happens if they damage the property?
Okay, so everyone knows the rules of the game.
Right. And what happens if someone breaks those rules? What are the consequences of breaching the lease? Got to spell it all out.
Wow, so a good lease agreement, it's really comprehensive, huh? Covers all the bases?
It should. It's there to prevent problems. Okay, so earlier we talked about how leases longer than 3 years need to be registered. Let's talk about that in more detail.
Yeah, I'm curious about that. What's the process like?
Okay, so in Thailand, if your lease is for more than 3 years, you have to register it with the land department.
Again, with the land department, so it's like extra official.
Exactly. It gives the lease more legal weight, makes it enforceable. And that's a good thing for both the landlord and the tenant.
Oh, so it protects both sides. Interesting.
It does. And if the property is sold, the registered lease stays in place. The new owner has to honor it.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about the current owner. It binds future owners, too.
Right. And it's not that complicated, honestly. It's just some paperwork, some fees, and that's it.
Well, that sounds worth it for the extra security, but what happens if a lease isn't registered?
If a lease that's longer than 3 years isn't registered, it might only be valid for 3 years, no matter what it says.
Oh, so it's like the lease gets cut short.
Yeah, that's a risk. Better to just register it and avoid any potential problems.
Good advice. Okay, so we've covered registration. What about ending a lease? What should we know about termination clauses?
Termination clauses, super important. These clauses spell out how the lease can be ended early by either the landlord or the tenant and what happens if that occurs.
Okay, so like what kind of situations would allow for early termination?
Lots of reasons. Could be a breach of contract, like the tenant isn't paying rent or they're damaging the property, or maybe some unforeseen circumstance like the landlord needs to sell the property or the tenant has to move for work.
Oh, right. Life happens. So these clauses basically provide a way out, legally and fairly.
Exactly. They're like the safety valve. And the clauses should be specific. They should outline the notice period, how much notice each party has to give, and any financial implications.
Financial implications? Like what?
Well, for example, if the tenant breaks the lease early, they might lose their security deposit. Or if the landlord ends the lease without a valid reason, they might have to compensate the tenant.
So it's like there are consequences for ending the lease early, but those consequences are clearly spelled out in advance.
Right. It's all about clarity and fairness.
And what about the length of the lease and renewals? What's typical in Thailand?
So in Thailand, the longest you can register a lease for is 30 years.
30 years, that's a long time.
It is. You might see longer agreements, but those can get complicated, especially when it comes to renewing them.
Oh, okay. So 30 years is like the safe zone.
Yeah, pretty much. And most leases are much shorter anyway. 1 year or 3 years are pretty common, especially for condos.
Makes sense. More flexibility that way. So what about renewing?
Renewals.
Yeah.
They're pretty straightforward. The landlord and tenant agree on new terms. Could be the same rent, could be different. They write up a new agreement, sign it, and if the original lease was registered, they should register the renewal too.
Okay, so it's basically starting a new lease, but with the same tenant.
Exactly. But remember, early termination, it's got to be clear in that initial lease. Both sides need to understand what happens if someone needs to end the lease early.
Right, and there might be penalties, like losing the security deposit.
Right. And it's good to know, Thailand has laws that protect tenants from landlords ending leases unfairly.
Yeah.
So landlords need to be aware of that.
Okay, good to know. All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about subletting. What happens if a tenant wants to rent out the property to someone else?
Subletting, it can be a bit tricky, especially for foreign landlords in Thailand.
Oh, how come?
Well, the biggest thing is your original lease agreement. If it says no subletting, then you can't allow it. End of story.
Okay, so that's the first thing to check. What if the lease doesn't say anything about subletting?
Then it might be okay. But Ocean Worldwide really emphasizes this. You should always get written permission from the property owner.
Just to be on the safe side.
Exactly. It's better to have it in writing, just in case any issues come up later on.
Makes sense. And short-term rentals, those are a whole other ballgame, right?
Right. Short-term rentals, like Airbnb-style stuff, those are under a lot of scrutiny. They often have different rules for registration, often stricter rules, too.
So it's not as simple as just putting your place up on a platform and calling it a day. Okay, so let's say subletting is allowed. What rights do subtenants have?
Subtenants, they have rights just like regular tenants. Most of their rights are determined by their agreement with your original tenant, the sublease.
Oh, so they have a separate lease with the original tenant.
Right. And that sublease, it should basically mirror the original lease. It should have all the same terms and conditions.
Makes sense. So what kind of rights are we talking about?
The right to quiet enjoyment. That means they can live there without being disturbed. And the right to a safe and habitable space. They also have protection against unlawful eviction. They can't be kicked out without a good reason.
So basically the same rights as the original tenant.
Right. And it's the original tenant's job to make sure the subtenant's rights are protected. They're like a mini landlord now.
Right, they've got responsibilities too. Okay, so if a foreign landlord allows subletting, what are their responsibilities?
A few things. First, you've got to make sure that the sublease doesn't break any of the rules in your original lease with the property owner.
Okay, so like making sure the subtenant isn't doing anything that the original tenant wasn't allowed to do.
Exactly. And you're still responsible for the taxes. Even though the rent is coming from the subtenant, you're still the one who has to report that income and pay the taxes.
Right. Still your property, your income. Makes sense. Anything else?
You're also still responsible for the property itself. You have to make sure it's safe and meets all the health and safety standards. You're the landlord. That's your job.
So even if it's a subtenant living there, the landlord is still ultimately responsible.
Right. You're also usually the point of contact if the subtenant has any issues, a leaky faucet, a broken appliance. You've got to take care of it. And if the subtenant does something that violates the original lease, you're responsible for that too.
Oh, wow. So subletting doesn't let the landlord completely off the hook.
Nope. And that's why Ocean Worldwide really emphasizes this point. Screen your tenants carefully. Even if they're subletting, you want to make sure they're reliable, that they can afford the rent, all that.
Right. A bad subtenant can cause a lot of problems for the landlord. Okay, let's move on to something a little less happy. Disputes. What happens when things go wrong?
Well, disputes, they happen, right? Even with the best lease agreements and the most well-intentioned people, sometimes things just go sideways.
Yeah, that's life.
So what options do foreign landlords have in Thailand if they have a dispute with their tenant? Okay, so Ocean Worldwide, they outline a few different approaches. One option, you can sue your tenant.
Sue them. Wow, that sounds serious.
It is. But it's a valid option if your tenant has done something that really violates the lease, like not paying rent or seriously damaging the property.
Right, you got to protect your investment.
Exactly. But going to court, it's a big step. The Thai legal system, it can be complex. Ocean Worldwide really recommends getting a lawyer involved, someone who knows Thai property law inside and out.
Okay, so legal action, that's option one. What are the other options?
Mediation and arbitration, those are two other ways to resolve disputes. They're less confrontational, I guess, than going straight to court.
Okay, tell me more about those. What's mediation?
Mediation, it's like having a neutral third party come in and try to help you and your tenant work things out. They don't make decisions, they just facilitate the conversation, try to find common ground.
Oh, I see. So it's more about finding a compromise that everyone can live with. What about arbitration?
Arbitration, it's similar, but the arbitrator, they actually make a decision, and that decision is legally binding. Both parties have to agree to abide by it.
Oh, so it's more formal than mediation.
Yeah. And both mediation and arbitration, they can be faster and cheaper than going to court, and they allow for more creative solutions sometimes.
Okay, so those are good options to consider before jumping straight to a lawsuit.
Right. And Ocean Worldwide, they suggest putting a clause in your lease agreement that requires mediation or arbitration before going to court.
Oh, that's a good idea. So, like, it forces everyone to try to resolve things amicably first.
Exactly. But sometimes going to court, it's unavoidable. If mediation and arbitration don't work, or if the issue is really serious.
Right. And if you do end up in court, you definitely need a good lawyer.
Absolutely. Someone who knows the Thai legal system. And you need to be prepared. Have all your documentation in order, the lease agreement, proof of payment, anything that supports your case.
Got it. So the key takeaway here, try to resolve disputes peacefully, but be prepared to take legal action if necessary.
Exactly. Oh, and Ocean Worldwide, they actually have this helpful table in their blog post that compares all three options.
A table. What does it say?
It lays out the pros and cons of each method. Mediation, it's cheaper and less confrontational, but it only works if both parties are willing to compromise. Arbitration, it's faster than going to court, and the decision is binding, but it can still be costly. And court, you get a legally enforceable decision, but it can be slow, expensive, and less flexible.
Okay, that's a really handy summary. All right, let's move on to insurance. What kind of insurance should foreign landlords in Thailand look into?
Insurance, so important. You don't want to be caught without it. But regular homeowners insurance, the kind you might have back home, it usually won't cover a rental property in Thailand.
Oh, really? So what kind of insurance do you need?
Landlord insurance, it's specifically designed for people who are renting out their properties.
Okay, and what does landlord insurance cover?
Lots of things. Damage to the property, like from fire or storms, lost rental income if the property becomes uninhabitable for some reason, and legal expenses if a tenant decides to sue you.
Oh, wow. That's a lot of coverage.
It is, and it's really worth it for the peace of mind. Ocean Worldwide, they recommend shopping around, comparing different policies, finding the one that fits your needs best.
Okay, so not all landlord insurance policies are created equal.
Nope. Some things to consider. Location of the property, if it's in a flood zone, you'll need extra coverage for that. Also, make sure you understand how Thai rental laws interact with the insurance policy.
Right, because the laws here might be different from back home.
Exactly. And there's another important type of coverage, liability.
Liability, what's that?
Liability insurance. It protects you if someone gets injured on your property. Let's say a tenant slips and falls on your stairs, they could sue you. Liability insurance can help cover those costs.
Oh, I see. So it's to protect you financially if someone gets hurt.
Right. You want to make sure you have enough coverage. And if you have things like a pool, double check that
Yeah.
that's covered too.
Good point. Okay, so landlord insurance covers the property, covers you if someone gets hurt. What about the tenant's belongings?
Ah, that's a good point. Landlord insurance, it doesn't cover the tenant stuff, their furniture, their clothes, all that.
Oh, okay. So what happens if their stuff gets damaged?
Well, Ocean Worldwide, they recommend encouraging your tenants to get their own insurance. Contents insurance. That covers their belongings against things like theft, fire, water damage.
Oh, I see. So it's like two separate insurance policies, one for the property, one for the stuff inside.
Exactly. It's a good idea to explain all this to your tenants. Maybe even put a clause in the lease agreement recommending they get contents insurance and making it clear that your insurance doesn't cover their stuff.
Yeah, that's a good way to avoid any confusion later on. All right, we've covered a lot of ground here. Ownership, laws, leases, taxes, insurance, even disputes. But there's one more thing I want to touch on. Culture.
Ah, culture. It's huge, especially in Thailand. It plays such a big role in how people interact.
Right, and I'm sure that extends to rental agreements, too. Are there any cultural considerations that foreign landlords should be aware of?
Oh, for sure. Ocean Worldwide, they highlight a few really important things. For example, in Thailand, bargaining is common. It's just part of the culture, especially when it comes to money.
Oh, interesting. So like haggling over the price.
Yeah. So if a potential tenant tries to negotiate the rent, don't be offended. It's not a sign of disrespect. It's just how things are done.
Okay, so be prepared to negotiate.
Exactly. And be prepared to talk about things that might seem a bit not personal. In Thailand, people are more likely to ask about your family, your background, things like that. It's not that they're being nosy. It's a way of building a relationship.
Oh, I see. So it's about building trust.
Yeah, it's all about that personal connection. And this is a big one, saving face. It's really important in Thai culture. You never want to make someone feel embarrassed or lose face.
Okay, so what does that mean in practice?
It means being polite, even if you disagree with someone. It means avoiding confrontation, being indirect. Instead of saying no directly, you might say something like, I'll have to think about that. Or maybe we could find a different solution.
Oh, I see. So it's about being respectful and finding a way to say things without being too blunt.
Exactly. And a little humor goes a long way. That have a great sense of humor. And don't forget the basics. Smiling, being polite, using the way greeting. It all shows respect.
Okay, so lots of cultural nuances to be aware of. It's definitely worth doing your research or talking to some locals to get a better understanding of the cultural expectations.
Absolutely. You'll have a much smoother experience as a landlord if you can navigate the cultural landscape as well as the legal one.
Could agree more. Okay, let's zoom back in on those local laws. How do they impact rental practices in Thailand? Let's talk about things like zoning, health and safety, building codes.
Zoning laws. Those are the rules that dictate how you can use your property. It's like
Yeah.
they divide the city into different zones, residential, commercial, industrial, all that.
Okay, and how do those affect rentals?
Well, they determine whether you can rent out your property at all, and if you can, what kind of rentals are allowed.
Oh, so like some zones might not allow any rentals?
Right. Or they might only allow